oral arguments regarding whether or not the injunction should be stayed or should remain in place. We have not heard a ruling yet. We don't know when that ruling will come. Sometimes the Fifth Circuit acts very quickly. Sometimes it takes its time. So until we hear back from the Fifth Circuit, we don't know if Chapter 51 will be allowed to be enforced or if it will continue to remain on hold. An injunction that the district court placed means that the Chapter 51 is on hold. It cannot be enforced. The Fifth Circuit right now has not placed a stay on the injunction. A stay on the injunction would allow Chapter 51 to be enforced. So right now the injunction remains in place, meaning that Chapter 51 cannot be enforced. So we are all in a holding pattern. I have met with the sheriffs in Hudspeth County and Culberson County. I have already relayed to them what some of our prosecutorial expectations are and how Chapter 51 relates to enforcement and what we need for an enforcement of the penal code sections in Chapter 51. I have a meeting scheduled next week with our law enforcement agencies here in El Paso. I have already met with the regional director for the DPS, which covers in particular for me, the 3 counties of which I'm the district attorney of, El Paso, Hudspeth, and Culberson County. So the Department of Public Safety DPS troopers know what my interpretation of what we need to enforce Chapter 51 statutes should the law be allowed to go in force and be enforced. Please understand that as a law enforcement official, I don't have a choice in enforcing the law. The law is the law and it has to be enforced. Only once the cases are, an arrest is made, only at that point can I then exercise prosecutorial discretion on a case-by-case basis for what we will or will not actually prosecute. I can tell you there are certain standards that myself as well as the other district attorneys from here all the way down to Brownsville are looking at when it comes to these cases. We all feel that particularly the very first part of Chapter 51, 51.02, which is illegal entry from a foreign country. This is the statute which says that if you come from a foreign country into the state of Texas, that this part of the statute requires a person, that law enforcement has to prove that a person comes into the state of Texas from a foreign country, immediately from a foreign country, without going through a port of entry, and is an alien to the state of Texas and to the United States. In order to prove that, myself as well as the district attorneys all the way down the border agree that this requires that law enforcement have their eyes on the individual entering the state of Texas. You cannot find someone and after arriving at a reasonable suspicion to detain the person and then find out later that they have entered the country illegally, make that arrest. You would have to get a warrant for that person to make the arrest, and you would still need to determine that they entered Texas from the foreign country. In El Paso in particular, a person could enter the state of New Mexico, from Mexico to New Mexico, and then enter Texas. They would not be in violation of Texas Penal Code Section 5102. Texas Penal Code Section 5102 requires a person to enter Texas from the foreign country, not Texas from New Mexico, from a foreign country. So it will only be applicable to someone who is coming directly from Mexico into Texas. So my instructions to law enforcement is, in order to be able to present a case to our office, that they actually witness the person, see the person entering Texas from a foreign country. There are other aspects of the code which allow for whether or not the offense would be a felony or a misdemeanor. That goes into the aspects of prosecutorial discretion, whether or not we would dismiss or decline or prosecute the case. and that goes into our case-by-case analysis. When we get into 51.03, this is illegal reentry by certain aliens. Anywhere in the state of Texas, if a person is found within the state of Texas to have been in the state of Texas illegally, they are not a U.S. citizen, they are in the state of Texas illegally, and they have been previously deported, then law enforcement can make that arrest. And there are certain criteria that I've gone over in our trainings with law enforcement on what they would require in order to be able to present that case to our office and what we would require in order to prosecute those cases. Again, there has to be a reasonable suspicion for the officer to make that detaining a person, and then they have to be able to develop probable cause to make the arrest. We're very conscious of any kind of allegations of profiling. We're very conscious of any kind of allegations of civil liberty violations. And we are very zealously guarding individuals' civil liberties and individuals' rights regarding their Fourth Amendment rights to be protected against illegal searches and seizures. So those are all part of the analysis that we would do as we're looking at the cases, and we will not prosecute a case where someone's rights and civil liberties have been violated. The final part of the law deals with deportation, which is 51.04, refusal to comply with an order to return to a foreign country. This is a little bit more complex part of the law, but the bottom line is that if a magistrate has ordered a person to be deported under Texas law, the officer takes the person to the border and they refuse to cross over the Mexican border into Mexico, then they can be prosecuted. I honestly do not think we're going to see very many of these cases. Bear in mind, if the Republic of Mexico refuses to accept a person, that is not that person refusing to comply with the law. They're unable to comply with the law, and they are not in violation of 5104 if the Republic of Mexico is refusing to take them. So we would not be prosecuting a person under 5104 if they are willing to be deported, but Mexico is not willing to take them. So a 5104 violation, I honestly do not believe we're going to see very many of those, if any. I understand that there are probably quite a few questions. I will be glad to answer your questions at this time. I will say, as an overall statement, I do not believe that we will see very many of these cases, if any, here in El Paso County. After talking with the sheriffs in Hudspeth and Culberson counties, I don't believe we're going to see very many of these cases, if any, in either of those two counties either. The concerns that have been expressed over Chapter 51 cases in my jurisdiction in the 34th Judicial District, I honestly believe are overblown. I do not anticipate seeing very many of these cases. That's just not the way our law enforcement is structured. That's not the way our law enforcement is set up. We just do not see very many cases of people coming across the border into Texas in this type of situation, and we just don't see our officers in an appetite from our law enforcement to try to enforce aspects of this law. I just don't see us having very many of these cases. As we screen these cases, we are also very cognizant of the limited resources that El Paso County has to book people and prosecute people with people booked in our county jail. Our county jail is very full at the moment. Of course, according to jail standards, we can't be completely full, so there is room in our county jail. So if a person does commit a violent offense, you can make sure that they will be booked in the county jail. But somebody who is not committing a violent offense, there just is not a lot of room to book people into our county jail. We don't have a lot of resources. Our office is short-staffed, and we don't have a lot of resources to spend on prosecuting cases that don't involve acts of violence. or that don't involve DWI, that don't involve a direct impact to the citizens of our community. We will evaluate every case on a case-by-case basis that comes to us, but as it stands right now, Chapter 51 is on hold. Even if it were to be in place, I still don't anticipate very many of these cases. Right now, our focus has been on the smuggling cases. While the majority of the smuggling cases do not, the majority of our smuggling cases result in a basic smuggling with basic individuals being caught in that situation, simple immigrants being caught. There are numerous instances where smuggling cases have resulted in a large group of females with one male. We know that those females were being trafficked. The smuggling cases have also led to stash house discoveries. In those stash house discoveries, we are seeing increasingly a large number of firearms being recovered, and we are also seeing females who have been sexually trafficked and are being sexually trafficked. I think that our smuggling cases are very important to our community because they are leading to the discovery of these stash houses, and we are intercepting and interceding people who are headed to the stash houses who are being trafficked, and we are interceding firearms in the course of this trafficking. So our smuggling, our focus remains on the smuggling cases. I'll go ahead and take questions.
Mr. Hicks, can you, in regard to the deportation aspect here, so are you saying Mexico is unwilling to accept anyone through this part of the process, that it's unenforceable?
The aspect of Chapter 51, 51.04, which is a criminal act if a person refuses to comply with the magistrate's order to be deported. We cannot enforce that if a person wants to. We take the person to the border and we say, you must be deported. The law enforcement officer says, you're hereby deported, you must leave. And they begin to cross the border and Mexico says, you can't come into the Republic of Mexico. Then that part of the law is unenforceable. I can't prosecute a person for a 5104 violation if they're willing to leave and Mexico's not willing to accept them. That's correct.
What happens after that if they, they can't, the situation can't be that they just walk on the port, right? So what would happen if Mexico sends them back?
They are back in the state of Texas. I don't know that. I assume that they would then become part of, be referred to Border Patrol, but I don't have an answer for that.
You also mentioned on some of these human smuggling cases, are these partly in regard to some of the high-speed pursuits we see from DPS? And what is your view of, that method of making those kinds of arrests?
I'll say that the high-speed pursuits you see are the vast minority of these cases. Our office sees between 5 to as many as 25 smuggling cases a day. You're seeing high-speed pursuits in a very, very few of these cases. When they're running for a reason. They're running because they were close to the stash house. They're running because the people they have in the car are high-priority targets. They're running because they have guns in the car. They're running for a reason. We actually see some of these cases where they're being pursued. They see the black and white car pull up behind them, and you can actually see the driver get on the phone and ask for directions from his the person that he's reporting to. And then after he gets those directions, then he starts running. It's a bad situation. It's a bad situation that smuggler is putting our community into. That smuggler causing accidents, that smuggler running into neighborhoods that they shouldn't be going into. It's that smuggler who's making the choice to run, and they're running for a reason. It's unfortunate.
Has your office been keeping an eye on what's going on with the border right now with the migrants clashing with the National Guard?
The situation yesterday, 425 individuals crossed at gate 36. We are aware of it.
Were there any arrests for trespassing, assault?
There's at least one arrest. An individual assaulted one of the National Guardsmen and was able to be detained. The investigation continues regarding other people who were involved in assaultive behavior. There is no pending investigation regarding trespass, but there are some investigations pending regarding assaultive behavior. And I will say this, if you are involved and you assault our National Guardsmen or our law enforcement, our Border Patrol, or our troopers, if you assault them, you will face prosecution. The criminal trespass is one thing, it's not assaultive behavior, but we cannot tolerate people thinking that they can assault our National Guardsmen, can assault our Border Patrol, can assault our troopers and get away with it. You can't do that. You can't.
Mr. Hicks, I know, so as part of the defendants in the SB4 case, you've mentioned that your interest, at least, was sort of around the prosecutorial discretion aspect. Can you just speak to what has played out on your end of things in this case?
My attorney has not argued against the injunction. From my perspective, I think it would be fine if the injunction were to remain in place. My attorney is arguing that because of prosecutorial, because of sovereign immunity, that I don't belong in the lawsuit, that I should be excused from the lawsuit. It's a kind of a lengthy argument, but the bottom line is that the county has sued me on the basis of if I were to be sued by a person who has been prosecuted under Chapter 51, then that would bring harm to the county. But with sovereign immunity, I'm immune from suit if I'm doing my job.
Mr. Hicks, can you comment on the lack of certainty? I mean, you alluded to the question about, what would happen to a Mexican national that wouldn't be allowed in. And so I guess as you're looking at this potentially being enacted, maybe not, it's kind of, you alluded to the tennis match. I mean, can you just talk about the lack of clarity as you're trying to figure out how to enforce this law if it were to go into effect?
Well, okay, anytime there's a new law, there's always going to be questions about how it's to be enforced, and then some of the issues as we work through the intricacies of a new law. That's the nature of having any new, brand new, on the books kind of law. There's always going to be some questions to it. Certainly with something as that has constitutional questions about whether or not it's constitutional or not, and once we're going to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, on the constitutionality of an issue, then we have even more questions about what is and is not going to be enforced eventually. This has caused our office to be a little slow in the rollout of our education with law enforcement on what to expect if SB4 were to be enforced. And it has caused a lot of question marks in the minds of law enforcement of, is this something I really need to be prepared to go out and enforce or not? So it's certainly an issue that we're all having to work through. And of course, having not been seen any of these cases because no arrests have been made, it's difficult to work through all of the questions. And as you know, as the question points out earlier about what to do if the person's refused deportation, there are a lot of questions that you can start running down the rabbit trails, and it leads you to a point where the prosecutor just kind of holds their hands up and says, I don't know.
Do you have the economic resources to enforce this law?
So, two things. This week, I have secured from the governor's office $1.1 million in grant money for this office. We haven't received the grant yet, but we've received the approval to receive the grant. So sometime in the next 3-4 weeks, we should actually get the grant. But another $1.1 million will be coming to our office in prosecutorial resources. That's a whole trial team, which includes a senior prosecutor, a paralegal, a victim advocate, an investigator, and then all of the resources they need, from a vehicle to computers and everything else. So that's going to help us have the resources we need to do this prosecution. We are still working with the governor's office and the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to set up other resources that the county will be able to utilize to further enable us to prosecute these cases as well as the smuggling cases, which will take some of the burden off of the financial burden off of El Paso County taxpayers. We haven't worked out all of those issues, so I'm not ready to release the details yet, but I'm working very hard with the governor's office, with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, with the Department of Standards of Jail Commissions, to try to work all of those details out so that we can relieve El Paso County and our taxpayers of a lot of that burden. And I feel confident that in another 2 or 3 weeks, I'll be able to have a press conference to make those announcements. We're over here first.
Real quick, your office is used, prosecuting cases of DWI, domestic violence. How rare or how common is a Penal Code 51 case?
Well, extremely rare because it hasn't been in place yet. So no district attorney's office in the state of Texas has seen a Chapter 51 case. There's not been a single arrest made under Chapter 51 as of today. If Chapter 51 goes into place, then there's an organization called the Border Prosecution Unit. This involves prosecutors from El Paso all the way down to Brownsville. The El Paso District Attorney's Office is the project director for the BPU, the Border Prosecution Unit. I was in a conference with the BPU just this past week, and I will tell you that the BPU is working very closely with the Department of Public Safety to coordinate the education of the Department of Public Safety and our local sheriffs on how to prosecute Chapter 51 cases and where those arrests will be made and how they'll be made. So we're working to coordinate that as a body, a unified body of prosecutors and law enforcement. We're over here somewhere?
Yes, so you briefly touched on this, but just other legal ramifications that you foresee coming from this new law, in regards to racial profiling or somebody who is a citizen, does get stopped and, violating their civil liberties.
So again, I want to emphasize that our office is very committed to making sure that no one's civil liberties are violated and that no one's constitutional rights are violated. So if we see even the hint of that in a case, we will not prosecute. We will immediately reject those cases. If part of the very elements of both the 5103, 5102 are that the officer has to prove that the person is an alien to the state of Texas and to the United States. So part of the ability for the officer to present those cases are that he has to be able to show that the person is not, in fact, not a U.S. citizen. There are various ways that the officer can do that. We've been talking about that, but that is part of the fabric of the case, the very proof of the case, the elements of the case. So if obviously if the person is showing up in the databases as being a USC, a United States citizen, then the case stops right there, and the person should be released immediately.
You mentioned that you don't expect to see many of these cases through this Chapter 51. Does that say anything about the necessity of the law or the merit?
Oh, well, remember, Texas is a big state. And while El Paso is very unique in that we sit on the border of 3 states, right? Between El Paso, Chihuahua, and Texas. With New Mexico right there, this law doesn't really apply to somebody who enters Texas from Mexico to New Mexico to Texas. So it throws a real kink in the law because someone could very easily come from Mexico into New Mexico and then into Texas. That's not necessarily true in Del Rio or even Brownsville, right? So in our other kind of major populated areas. I certainly would not speak for the legislators and their legislative priorities for the rest of Texas. I can tell you that for El Paso, I don't think that we're going to see very many of these cases.
And then building off that, with the huge rush of migrants on the border right now, will that have any impact on SB4, or is that a completely different situation?
Well, I guess if we played out a hypothetical, and I really don't like to play hypotheticals, if 425 people who came across the border yesterday, all of those people would be eligible for prosecution under 4102, right? The crossing the border illegally. I'm sorry, 5102. So 5102, they would be all eligible for prosecution. However, the resources that El Paso County has would not allow for all 425 of those people to be prosecuted, because we don't have the ability to book that number through our process those people through our booking, or book that number into our jail. So the surges that we're seeing are concerning, but they're not something that Chapter SB4 or 5102 could really address, because that number overwhelms 5102 and our ability to prosecute. Now, that doesn't mean that the bad actors in that group can't be prosecuted. So someone who is in that group who has caused harm to our law enforcement can certainly be picked out and prosecuted, and will be picked out and prosecuted. Again, don't feel that you can come across our border and harm our Border Patrol agents, our National Guardsmen, or our law enforcement officers who are just trying to do their job, and think that you can harm them and get away with it.
Mr. Hicks, there's been a recent study about the likelihood of migrants to commit a crime compared to native-born citizens. At least to the experience here and your jurisdiction in Hudspeth and Culberson County. What is your take on a study like that? And have you seen any real violent crime from migrants or criminal activity from migrants other than having across the border?
I haven't seen that study. I really couldn't speak to that study. I don't know. I can tell you that there's a criminal element in any large group of people. While the majority of the migrants that I have seen have been law-abiding people, there is a criminal element in every group of people. You know, out of 1,000 people, there may be 2 or 3 or 4, or 5 or 10 criminal elements there, and whatever criminal element there is in any large group of people, that criminal element is going to remain a criminal element. If you take, we go to the monster truck jam here in El Paso, and you pack 20,000 people into the Sun Bowl, there's going to be a criminal element running around in the Sun Bowl. It doesn't matter what group of people you have. There's always going to be a criminal element in that group of people, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about immigrants or migrants or people from the west side of El Paso. There's always going to be a